So, after further thought, it may make sense to call Ms. Middleton straight away, just to avoid the difficulties of moving equipment round between presentation and witness evidence.
Well, let's do that. Ms. Middleton, would you like to come forward? And Lauren will swear you in.
Please state your full name. Sarah Middleton. Please repeat after me.
You needn't leave your mask on if you would.
Oh, sorry, yes.
It'd probably be easier for us to
Keep forgetting I've got it on, sorry.
No, well, it's become the new way of life.
It is.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely,
I do solemnly, sincerely,
and truly declare and affirm
and truly declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth,
that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
And it is, I think, Ms. Middleton.
Yes. Thank you.
Ms. Middleton,
Yes.
you provided the inquiry with a statement dated the 14th of April 2021. I'd just like to ask you one or two things about your qualifications and your early career. If we could have on screen, please, WITN 5666001, please. Civic. We can see from the statement that you did a BSc in biochemistry at the University of St Andrews between 1966 and 1969, is that right?
Yes.
And then if we go over to the second page, please, Civic. The outline of your career, I'll come back to fill in some more detail on this in due course. But from 1969 to 1976, you were at the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh as a biochemist, is that right?
Yes.
So was that your first job after
That's
university?
my first job, yes.
1976 to 1979, you were at the Department of Medicine, University of Glasgow, again as a biochemist.
Yes.
And then 1979 to 1987, it says here, was Baywood Laboratories Chief Scientist.
Yes.
Is the 1987 date correct?
I think that includes consultancy work that I did subsequently.
I understand. 1987 to 1996, another firm, Delta Biotechnology Limited,
Yeah.
working on recombinant human albumin in yeast.
Yes.
1996 to 2001, Andaris Limited, Director of Targeted Therapeutics. And then 2001 to 2016, you founded Hemostatics Limited as CEO and CTO.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
You haven't, as I understand it, given evidence previously to any inquiry about the infected blood.
No.
But you were interviewed with respect to a US class action. Without giving away any confidences that you can't give away, what were the circumstances of that interview?
I have very little recollection, actually. I was called to London and interviewed by American attorneys, and I thought that was a class action on behalf of haemophiliacs in the United States. And I was interviewed twice, but nothing ever came of it, and there were no written papers or anything.
Do you know on whose behalf the attorneys were acting?
I suspect they were acting on behalf of the haemophiliacs.
The plaintiffs of the act?
Yeah, the plaintiffs. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to begin, if I may, by asking you a few questions about the Protein Fractionation Centre in Edinburgh and your time there. As we've seen, you joined in 1969, directly after university.
Yeah.
Who was your line manager, if such a thing as a...
Jim Smith, Dr. Smith.
Which department were you in?
Well, we were one big department, or one little department, in the bowels of the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, and we were there were a group of us, about 15 of us, I guess, learning to fractionate blood.
Under the guidance of Dr. Smith.
Yes. Well, Dr. Smith was my immediate boss. The organisation was run by Mr. John Watt, who is a vet. And then he was, I suppose, reporting to, it wasn't John Cash, it was the predecessor, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name.
I understand.
Head of Blood Transfusion Service.
You say there were about 15 of you.
Approximately.
What kind of gradations were there in terms of the different work that was being done, in terms of the seniority of the people?
Well, I was first employed as a technician and was promoted to biochemist, but mostly we were technicians. They were technicians.
When you say you were promoted to biochemist from a technician, can you
Yes.
recall when that happened?
After about a year, I think, about a year.
Should I understand from what you've said there that you weren't in any policy formulating
No.
role at that time?
No, I was doing what I was told
By Dr. Smith.
by Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Just so that we are clear, that's the same Dr. Jim Smith who later
Yes.
moves to BPL and
Yes.
with whom you worked at BPL.
Yes.
If we could have page 1 of your witness statement back on screen, please. Sorry, page 2 of your witness statement back on screen, please. The description that you give of the different processes involved, if I could just ask you to expand a little and explain in layperson's terms, as insofar as it is able, the different elements of your work there. The first being purification of factor 9 for human
Yes.
plasma using ion exchange resin.
Yes.
Could you just describe what you were doing, when you were doing it, and what the product was?
The purification took the supernatant from cryoprecipitate, which was cryosupernatant, and was diluted and then passed over an ion exchange resin in order to prepare a concentrate of factor 2, 9 and 10. There was no factor 7, which was in some concentrates. The issue for factor 9 is that it can be thrombogenic. In other words, it can actually promote clotting outside of the action of factor 9. So you want it to be controlled and not produce clots when you're not expecting it. And this factor 9 was very clean and didn't appear to activate clotting factors as some concentrates did. So it's regarded as very safe.
Is this a forerunner of the products that became Defix?
No, that is defix.
It is Defix.
Yes.
So the first bullet point there we should understand to be working on the production of
Defix, yes.
and was that the first time that it was being produced?
Yes.
1969 time?
Yes, it was.
Could we have on screen, please, Cernic, PRSE 303648, please? This is a document that we provided you with. We provided 2 sets of documents.
Yes.
This is the second set.
Yes.
And it is a article from Vox Sang,
Yeah.
volume 24, pages 441 to 456 from
Yeah.
1973.
Yes.
Entitled A Therapeutic Concentrate of Coagulation Factors 2, 9 and 10 from Citrated Factor 8 Depleted Plasma.
Yes.
You're listed as the lead author there with
Yeah.
Ida Bennett and J.K. Smith, presumably Dr. Smith.
Yeah.
We could just look at the abstract, please, Cernic. Abstract, a simple procedure is described for the large-scale absorption onto DEAE cellulose of coagulation factors 2, 9 and 10 from citrated factor 8 depleted plasma. The coagulation factors are eluted frontally from the exchanger in a high yield and in a form suitable for therapeutic use without further fractionation. The lyophilized concentrate is very stable without the addition of heparin, and when redissolved
Isosmolar.
Isosmolar. Forgive my repeated butchering of pronunciations as we go through. Contains approximately 30 units per milliliter of factors 2, 9, 10, 250 to 300 times purified from a starting plasma. The effectiveness of the concentrate of the treatment of haemophilia B is discussed.
Yes.
So that's the abstract of the article. Should I take it that this article is describing the process that you have just described to us?
Yes.
This is the formulation of DEFIX.
Yeah.
To the best of your knowledge, was this article from 1973 the first publication of the DEFIX product?
Yes.
If we just look at the introduction sector, a couple of points to pick out from it. Until 1967, only fresh frozen plasma could be offered in Scotland for correcting deficiencies of coagulation factors 2, 7, 9 and 10. Such treatment was frequently inadequate to maintain hemostatic levels of factor 9 in patients with severe haemophilia B during major bleeding episodes or surgery.
Yeah.
Since 1967, the Protein Fractionation Centre has made approximately 1,100 doses of PPSB from blood collected in EDTA by the method published by Soulier. What was PPSB?
That was a 4-factor concentrate which contained factor 7 in addition to factor 2, 9 and 10. Now, I can't actually remember how PPSB was made, but it's obviously it started off in blood collected in EDTA, which is rather difficult because none of the other fractions can be collected from that blood.
Could you just explain EDTA to us?
Oh, ethylene diamine tetracetic acid.
I won't try and repeat that. This product represents, going back to the article.
Yeah.
This product represented an important advance in the treatment of haemophilia B, and its use has been extended to an increasing number of other deficiencies of the prothrombin complex of coagulation factors. The demand for PPSB for use, e.g. in liver disease and the reversal of anticoagulation therapy, at times threatened to exhaust the stocks required for emergency treatment of haemophilia B and prompted us to look for new methods of recovering factor 9 or prothrombin complex from normal citrated plasma. A large increase in the production of BPSB was considered uneconomical of limited fresh blood resources because cellular components and factor 8 are not readily recovered from blood collected in EDTA. It was hoped that an alternative method could be devised to improve the yield of factor 9, only about 30% in large-scale production of PPSB, and end our dependence on procuring batches of tricalcium phosphate with the appropriate absorptive properties. If I just pause there for a moment, am I right in understanding that to mean that your work in trying to create DEFIX was a response to the need for more product and concerns about running short of the existing product?
More product and more efficient use of blood.
Going back to the article, this report describes the absorption of factors 2, 9 and 10 from large batches of citrated Cohen supernatant on DEAE cellulose and their selective elution in a form suitable for freeze drying and administration to patients without further purification or stabilization.
Yep.
That's supernatant 1, I think it just said there, isn't it?
Yes, Cohen supernatant.
Cohen supernatant 1. Sorry, my printed version is not.
It's actually cryosupernatant.
Cryosupernatant.
Yeah.
I'm not going to go through the technical detail of the article, but if we could please go to electronic page 11, which is internal page 451, the section dealing with transmission of serum hepatitis.
Yeah.
What is written is this, I quote, "More than 20 batches, each made from 200 to 600 donations of plasma, have been used since May 1970. In Scotland, screening of all donations of blood for Australian antigen by immunodiffusion or immunoelectroosmophoresis became routine during 1971. Using such methods, which detect probably less than 50% of Australian antigen carriers, the incidence of antigenemia among blood donors in Scotland has been found to be about 0.07%. All batches of a factor 2, 9 and 10 concentrate have been tested for Australian antigen by the methods used for donor plasma, usually in 5-fold concentration. Australian antigen has not been found in any batch, nor has any recipient developed hepatitis or Australian antigenemia following treatment with the concentrate alone. Since the methods used to detect the agent causing serum hepatitis were very insensitive, and since no systematic attempt has been made to assess the incidence of subclinical hepatitis in the recipients, it would be prudent to assume that the concentrate could be infective if made from infective plasma, but it seems likely that the concentration of the infective agent is substantially reduced by the preparative procedure. A couple of things to pick up from there. First of all, the batch size that is cited there, which is 200 to 600 donations of plasma. Am I right to understand that those were the batch sizes that were used in the work that you were doing at that time?
Yes.
Do you know why there was such a variation between 200 and 600 donations?
Well, I suspect that at the time I'm fairly sure we were making it and scaling up as we went along.
Scaling up to use
more plasma and bigger columns.
Do you know how the batch size developed in terms of the factor 9 product produced at PFC during the remainder of your time there to 1976?
I'm actually not sure what size it went up to.
Do you recall what discussions were taking place within PFC about batch size around this time?
No.
The article here clearly demonstrates an awareness of the risk of what is described as Australia antigen,
Yeah.
serum hepatitis at the time.
Yeah.
Do you know whether there was discussion, recognition of whether or not that risk increased with a larger batch size?
No, I don't know whether there was, but it's likely, isn't it, that it would have been.
Do you think you would have been involved in those discussions, or were they?
I was only a lowly technician at the time. I wasn't involved in those discussions.
Those would have been matters for whom?
Probably Jim Smith, and or the director of the blood transfusion service, whoever that was. I don't think it was John Cash, it was somebody
Predecessor
else.
of Mr.
The predecessor.
Do you remember what information you were given, or what training you were given about the risk of hepatitis from such products at this time?
We were aware of hepatitis as a potential problem, but I have to say, I don't think we took a great deal of precautions for it at the time. We weren't that aware of it. I suspect Scottish plasma was thought to be a fairly clean plasma, so I can't really answer that question, but we did actually have a technician in the blood transfusion service who did have an accident with a positive hepatitis B donation, and she subsequently died, so there was definitely an awareness.
Are you able to say approximately when that occurred?
Well, it was probably in the first couple of years, I think, that I was there.
Early
Maybe
70s?
a bit longer, yeah, early 70s.
Are you able to, this is a very difficult question thinking back all these years, are you able to recall what kind of journals, learning that you would have been keeping up to date with at that time?
Well, obviously Vox Sanguinis was one of them. Blood, thrombosis and hemostasis. those are the ones I sort of remember. Vox sanguinis was very much the one to do with fractionation. Obviously, blood. No virology journals specifically, but the hepatitis would have been discussed in some of those other ones that I've mentioned.
Were they made available to you at the PFC, or did you have to find them off your own back?
No, they were available.
I'd like to just, again, pick up a couple of more things from that section. There's a reference to the testing that became routine during 1971. Should we understand that before that there was no routine testing for hepatitis?
Possibly not. The assays, as they say, were rather insensitive at the time.
But that's what I was going to ask next. So there's a figure of probably less than 50% given.
Yes.
So an awareness then that
Yeah.
testing wasn't going to catch everybody.
Yes.
The figure that is given about for blood donors in Scotland being found to be about 0.07% infected.
I think we've lost it on the screen.
Yes.
Sorry,
we
can we
have
back
lost
up?
it on the screen.
Apologies.
Thank you.
If we could highlight the middle paragraph, transmission of serum hepatitis. Thank you.
Yes.
So we can see that figure there given of 0.07%
Yeah.
for incidence among blood donors in Scotland. How much faith should we put in that figure given the limited sensitivity of testing at the time?
I can't answer that question. I won't answer that question. Something just in sort of qualification of all of this, there was insufficient factor 9 available, and very much the emphasis with everything I did at PFC and subsequently really was with the aim of getting a product out there to treat haemophilia, because there were problems obviously for haemophiliacs who didn't get treatment. So bleeding was regarded as the first problem.
The question of the risk and benefit of these products, was that a question for you to consider as a biochemist and previously a technician, or was that for others?
That was more for others, I think. But it was definitely very important.
The conclusion of that sentence says it would be prudent to assume that the concentrate could be infective if made from infective plasma, but it seems likely that the concentration of the infective agent is substantially reduced by the preparative procedure.
Yeah.
Do you know the reasons why it was thought that the procedure was...
Well, the agent, the factors 2, 9 and 10, clotting factors, were absorbed to the resin. It was very likely that the infective agent wouldn't be absorbed, would remain in the supernatant, and therefore it could be concluded possibly that there would be a reduction in any event of virus.
What was the basis for thinking that the virus would...
Well, the virus is very big, and I think it wouldn't, and it subsequently turned out to be the case, it wouldn't absorb or be bound to a positively charged resin.
And that is, you think, the reason for that final clause in the final sentence?
Yes.
May I just ask, who was it who first had the idea of using electrically charged resin to attract certain proteins and not others?
Well, it was Jim Smith's, the method. The method actually did come, I think, from the Dutch. I think it was the Dutch, or was it the Swiss? Somebody in Europe who was already using this cellulose method. Other manufacturers were using similar resins, but not the same, positively charged resins, and getting 4-factor concentrates. At the end of the day, the difference between the resins and the products made was going to be probably the amount of activation of clotting factors that you got between the different products. And that was really the difference between them.
Do I understand the start of that answer to be that this idea,
Yes.
insofar as it was exploited in PFC, was
Yeah.
that of Dr. Smith?
Yes, that of Dr. Smith within PFC, but it was being used in other places, other facilities.
So the inspiration, the basic idea scientifically was somebody else's in Europe, you
I
think?
think it came from somebody else in Europe.
And
Because it
roughly,
was quite common. People were using cellulose or saccharose, I think. One was more highly charged than the other. And Oxford, the haemophilia centre there, I think were using the saccharose product, but I might be wrong, the 4-factor.
yes.
So it was fairly well known to use a positively charged resin.
Thank you.
If I could go, please, to electronic page 15 of the document, internal page 455. This may follow from the answers that you've given already, but if we look at the second paragraph there, it's stated, this is in the concluding section, there is no reason to believe that the concentrate cannot transmit serum hepatitis.
Yeah.
However, it is probably better in this respect than alternative sources of factor 9, including plasma. Do I understand from your previous answer that the reason for that is the technique that was used was thought to have a degree of viral inactivation?
Yes, well, viral separation.
I'm going to take you to another article now, if I may. It's again one of yours. If we could have PRSE 0003799.
Oh, right, yes.
This is the Journal of Laboratory and Clinical Medicine
Yeah.
from 1976, volume
Yeah.
88, pages 91 to 101. Removal of hepatitis B surface antigen from plasma fractions.
Yes.
We can see the authors are Dr. Johnson and his colleagues from New York, and you and Jim Smith from Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And you refer in your statement, the second of your bullet points was purification, third of your bullet points was clearance of hepatitis B from factor 9 concentrate using polyethylene glycol
Yes.
precipitation. And am I right to think of this article covers that aspect of your work?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Before we delve into it, could I ask you again for a quick potted guide of what polyethylene glycol precipitation is?
Polyethylene glycol is a large molecular weight polymer, and you can add it to solutions of protein when it would cause precipitation of proteins in a selective way, depending on their charge. And you can, by adjusting the pH of the solution, adding the polyethylene glycol, you can get selective precipitation of certain proteins.
Thank
So
you.
size and charge.
Size and charge. If we could look at the abstract, please. Endogenous or deliberately added hepatitis B antigen was removed and concentrated for assay from albumin and from coagulation factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 concentrates as model plasma fractions. The concentrates carry considerable risk of causing hepatitis in transfused patients. The amount of antigen remaining in the fraction was estimated to be less than 1/10,000th of that detectable by the ASRIA-2 radioimmune assay and 1/100th of that found to be infectious when highly contaminated human sera were diluted and injected in chimpanzees. Batch fractionation methods with polyethylene glycol were used. Yield of albumin was 96% and of coagulation factors about 90%. So an overview there of the article. Going to the first paragraph, it says the high incidence of hepatitis from the administration of blood and plasma fractions remains a serious problem, despite governmental requirements to pre-test donors for the hepatitis B antigen. Use of the counter-electrophoresis (CEP) assay for screening donors has reduced the overall incidence of serum hepatitis by nearly 30%, and most investigators feel the use of the more sensitive radioimmune assay has reduced it by about 50%. However, pre-testing has failed to achieve further reduction because of possible contamination of the blood by infectious agents capable of causing non-A, non-B hepatitis and insufficient sensitivity of the assay. Just pausing there for a moment, two factors mentioned. One is the same as with the previous article, there's a lack of sensitivity in the testing. And the second is a reference here in this article from 1976 to non-A, non-B hepatitis. So
Yeah.
plainly, you were aware at that stage of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes, which is now hepatitis C.
Yes. Can you recall how serious non-A, non-B was considered to be as a risk to potential patients at that time?
Well, once again, at this time, the overall objective was to stop the patients from bleeding. And while we were doing this work, obviously, to try and improve the situation as far as the hepatitis was concerned, that's all I was sort of aware of. Obviously, we were aware of hepatitis. We had the agent, we developed these agents to try and stop bleeding first. Second, we wanted to try and address the hepatitis problem.
So that everybody is clear, your role as a biochemist was to work on those projects,
Yes.
not to decide whether or not the treatment that resulted from it should be given to a patient.
No. I mean, yes.
You agree with the proposition?
Yes.
Do you recall what discussions were taking place at around that time about other pathogens or potential pathogens in blood products?
In the 1970s?
Yes.
No.
If I could turn, please, to electronic page 7 of the article. Forgive me, I miscounted. Electronic page 8, please. Internal page 98. This is in the discussion section. The second paragraph down, it says, our purpose has been to reduce the antigen level in selected model plasma fractions, albumin and factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 concentrates, 10 to the power of 5 or 10 to the power of 4 particles per milliliter, and then inject the material in chimpanzees to determine its infectivity. So, am I right in seeing this as a spiked sample that would then be inserted into the chimpanzees?
Yes.
It goes on, albumin is normally heated to 60 degrees centigrade to prevent hepatitis, but since this temperature would cause inactivation of the factor 2, 7, 9 and 10 concentrates, they cannot be heated and carry a strong risk of causing hepatitis in recipients. So albumin was known at that time could be subjected to a heat treatment at 60 degrees C.
Yes.
But according to this article, factor 9 and the other factors couldn't be.
That's what was considered at the time. They couldn't be.
Do you know why that was considered so?
Well, they were both, they're all quite labile proteins, which is subject to denaturation, whereas albumin is known to be a very robust protein. And can be heated, and it was heated at 60 degrees for 10 hours. originally to remove bacteria.
Do you know if any work was going on within PFC at that time about heat treatment
No,
of those factors?
not in those. No, not at that time.
No, the work wasn't going on, or no, you don't?
No, the work was not going on. I'm not even sure that people in those days, we all believed what is said here, that they can't be heat treated. And that was what was believed at the time.
Received wisdom, as it were.
It sort of received wisdom from what we knew about those proteins.
But was there any discussion, as far as you recall, about the possibility?
It was dismissed at the time as being unlikely to be possible, which is why we looked at this precipitation method.
If we could go on to the next paragraph. In collaborative studies with Dr. Hufnagel, 2 chimpanzees were injected with PEG fractionated 2, 7, 9 and 10 concentrates, which were known to be infectious, and I'm afraid the copy isn't good here, and contained at least 10 to the power of 11 antigen particles per milliliter prior to PEG fractionation. That's polyethylene glycol fractionation. But these concentrates were prepared by an earlier version of the PEG procedure, which I'm afraid I can't...
Utilised, I think. Utilised?
0.15 molar sodium chloride and could not quantitatively remove the HBsAg below levels of 10 to the...
Fifth, I
10
think.
to the 8th.
Fifth, eighth?
It couldn't anyway.
I think 10 to the power of 5.
Yes, they didn't get a very good result.
It says one of the 2 injected animals
became infected,
while the other did not.
Yeah.
Could you just talk us through that aspect and the significance both of the previous method being used and the fact that one of the chimpanzees became infected?
Actually, I can't, because I'm not quite sure what this actually meant now, going back 40 years. I apologise for that. I'm not quite sure what the procedure was that was different.
But you say they didn't get a very good result. Whatever that procedure was,
It didn't seem to work.
Hadn't inactivated it or separated the...
No, it hadn't separated it out.
I'm just going to take you to see if we could perhaps get some assistance from Peter Foster's evidence to the Penrose inquiry.
Right.
You're aware of Dr.
Yes.
Foster?
Yes.
He became a colleague of yours.
Yes, he did.
Course.
Yes.
If we could have on screen, please, Sir Mick, PRSE 303349. This is one of the documents that you were provided with. We could have page 3 of that. Oh, sorry, just leave it there for 1 second. We can see that this is the witness statement of Peter Foster to the Penrose inquiry, or one of his witness statements. If we could turn to page 3 of that, please. And paragraph F. It says, Dr. Foster said this: Factor 9 prepared experimentally in the USA by this procedure from plasma known to contain hepatitis B infectivity was tested by Dr. Johnson in chimpanzees. The chimpanzees developed hepatitis B, demonstrating that hepatitis B infectivity had not been fully removed. And then there is a citation, which is to the article that we have just seen.
Yeah.
So, leaving aside the reference to whether or not it was 1 chimpanzee or 2 chimpanzees that became infected, Dr. Foster's take from the paper, as it were, is that the process hadn't been successful.
Yes.
Or I should say wholly successful.
Well,
may have reduced.
not really successful. It wasn't successful.
Yes. And that's a conclusion you would agree with?
I would agree with that.
If we could just go to G, then. Dr. Johnson subsequently refined the precipitation parameters, a revised method being known as the Mark II method, to obtain greater removal of the hepatitis B virus. However, he told me that his application for funding for another chimpanzee study to discover if the removal of hepatitis B infectivity had been successful was rejected by the USA National Institute of Health, NIH, because they considered that, and he quotes, hepatitis is no longer a problem.
Oh, that's interesting.
Is that something that you were aware of or
No.
can assist us with?
I wasn't.
We will leave that for Dr. Foster then. If we could continue on as we are here to H, another issue that arose with factor 9 prepared by the first Mark I version of the method was a thrombogenic reaction in dogs, and a paper from Dr. Cash is cited, suggesting that the product might be harmful to patients. Alternatively, this may have been a consequence of very high dose of factor 9.
Sorry.
So going over to, consequence of very high dose of factor 9 that had been administered in this study, as the product was more concentrated than established factor 9 concentrates. Were you aware of or involved in the cash work which led to the production of that article?
Yes, we supplied the concentrates for it. And actually I was surprised because I didn't recall, and I have read Peter's submission, but I was surprised because it could have been because it was a very high dose of factor 9 that was administered. That's all I can conclude from that.
Yes.
And that, because a lot of factor 9, a lot of factor 2, a lot of factor 10, that could be the result of, that could be resulting in this thrombogenicity that I referred to.
Yes. Yes.
But that was the defects.
That was the defects that you supplied to Dr.
Yes,
Cash for
yes.
that article.
Yes.
So a slightly different stream of work.
No, that was defects. And what, well, I think it was. I think that's what he's referring to. If you go back to the page before, can you just... Oh, I'm apologising. Sorry, he wasn't referring to defects.
We will pick this up with Dr. Foster in due course.
Yes, because when we went on to use the polyethylene glycol process that Dr. Johnson had developed, we did a parallel. We did it with no, obviously, hepatitis added in. We did it just to look at the fractionation of factor 9. Through this polyethylene glycol process, we actually got a reduction in thrombogenic material by tests that were introduced later, which was again one of those publications that we had.
I'm just going to take you back to the 1976 article, which you were a co-author. If we could have on screen, please, Cermic PRSE 303799. Internal page 99. So I think page 8 of the electronic version. I'm afraid I don't have a marked copy there. Sorry, page
That's
9.
98.
Thank you. I just want to take you to the final paragraph. Although the clinical value of a PEG method for removing hepatitis B must be confirmed by further studies in chimpanzees, we fully expect that its application to selected clinically useful blood fractions will reduce or even eliminate post-transfusion hepatitis due to hepatitis B antigen contained in these administered fractions. Could you just explain the basis for that thinking?
Well, I think there was only 2 chimpanzees. The method was refined, and I think he felt that the use of a precipitation method to precipitate out the virus, which is obviously very big and very heavy, theoretically it would be a good method.
Should we read this as being that although there has been infectivity with the Mark 1 method, Dr. Johnson is already thinking about the Mark 2 method and is optimistic for the results that may be obtained?
Yes.
And we see an express reference to the need for further chimpanzee studies.
Yes.
We can tie that back to what Dr. Foster said and pick that up with him in due course. Thank you. One further article from your time at PFC, or published after your time, but referring back to while you were there. Could we have, please, WITN 2235010? The second page of this, please. An article from a British Journal of Haematology in 1981, volume 47, pages 91 to 104. An article by Dr. Prowse and Dr. Cash, The Use of Factor IX Concentrates in Man, a 9-year experience of Scottish concentrates in the southeast of Scotland. You are not an author of this paper. It is published after you have left the PFC, but would include periods that you were at the PFC if it's a 9-year study. Is that fair?
Yes.
Did you have any role in the study to which this article refers?
No. No.
I will leave it there. Returning to your witness statement, you also say that while you were at the PFC, you were involved in purification of factor 8 from human blood using purified cryoprecipitate fraction. Could you just briefly explain what that involved?
Well, it was well known and was used single donor cryoprecipitate, which means that plasma was thawed very slowly to not more than 5 degrees, and the precipitate that was factor 8 and fibrinogen and large proteins was recovered. This is a very slow process, but it was single donor, which was an advantage from the hepatitis point of view. But it was very slow, and if a patient was bleeding, it was not a particularly useful thing to do. So what I did, again with Dr. Smith, was to make bulk preparations of cryoprecipitate, which essentially involved taking large amounts of plasma, thawing it out very slowly with mixing to get a cryoprecipitate, which would then be dissolved and essentially dissolved and formulated to make a bulk product, which could be freeze-dried. And that was the first factor 8 to be made by that method in Scotland.
Very difficult question, but can you remember the time span in which you were engaged in that work, and particularly when it came to...
Well, I did it almost when I first started my first, in the first couple of years.
So 1969 to 1971?
Yes, I guess so, yeah.
How, I may ask a broad question, how successful was the product that was created in that way?
Quite successful.
Was it used by clinicians and accepted by clinicians?
Yes, it was. In fact, after I left PFC, which was for reasons of, I had a husband who moved to the west coast of Scotland, and I went to Glasgow and worked with a haemophilia director there, and was involved and saw the treatment of patients for the first time, really. And they were using some of that concentrate, and it just made such a difference for the patients to be able to have a freeze-dried concentrate used immediately out of the fridge for immediate use.
This concentrate, should we understand that it was essentially a freeze-dried cryoprecipitate
Yes.
rather than a what became known as freeze-dried factor concentrates at a later stage rather than pooled plasma.
It was. I'm not sure I understand your
Oh,
question.
sorry.
It was a freeze-dried. It was freeze-dried cryoprecipitate, but made in bulk. So you got several hundred vials from a batch
I see.
that were freeze-dried.
So how many? What was the pool size of the cryoprecipitate?
Well, I know initially it was about 20 litres, but I can't remember how many units that,
Yes.
how much that made. But
So obviously obtained from more than one donor of that size.
yes, it was.
You said initially. Do you remember if that?
I don't know
After
how
the size?
high, because it was being done in a small facility and using small-scale equipment, and therefore we were somewhat limited to about 20 litres. Now, I'm sure it went up to about 100 litres subsequently, but that's what I recall doing.
Can I just tell you, we've had a conversion factor used in the course of the last week or so of somewhere around 600 mils per litre of whole blood is plasma.
Yeah,
And so if that is so,
yes,
then a donation of plasma is about 600 mils.
yes,
So 20 litres would give you somewhere between 35 and 40 donors.
yes,
Or donations, I should say, because they might be the same donor giving a couple of pints.
most likely single at that point. Yes, that'd be right.
That would be right.
Yes.
Same question as earlier. Were you involved in any discussions about the potential risk of
No.
increasing the donor size?
No.
Again, a decision made at a higher level.
Yes.
The final bullet point that you gave for PFC is the evaluation of plasma fractionation using solid phase polyelectrolyte based on ethylene maleic anhydride.
Yes.
Now, with some trepidation, given that I attempted an explanation earlier, could I ask for your explanation of what polyelectrolyte fractionation is, please?
Well, essentially, it was just a novel polymer, positively charged polymer, that was, I can't remember its original use from Monsanto, but it was being evaluated for plasma fractionation. And there were variations on the degree of positive charge that could be introduced into it. So there was one called E100, which was 100% substitute with positive charge, which was used, potentially, which was developed to purify albumin and gamma globulin away from each other. And then there was the one that, when I first evaluated those polyelectrolytes, I went to New York. There was no, from my recollection, and I think this is true, there was no polyelectrolyte at that point that was useful for factor VIII. I don't know whether it was because the factor VIII wouldn't come off the polyelectrolyte. I suspect that was the case. But at that time, there wasn't one. So I ended up, from PFC, I went over and learnt about albumin and gamma globulin.
Was that at Dr. Johnson's?
That was in Dr. Johnson's lab.
You mentioned Monsanto.
Yes.
That was the company that was providing the polyelectrolyte.
Yes,
Yes. And that's the same company as later provided.
yes,
Well, even at this time was providing Spayward and you would.
yes, yes.
Other than those areas that we've discussed, were you involved in any other viral separation or viral inactivation work in PFC at that time?
No, only the creation of Super 9, which we've talked about, the PEG.
That's
PEG
the
precipitated. Yeah.
And we will come back to Super 9, perhaps with Dr. Foster or with others.
And I did actually, I did actually look at separation of viruses with polyelectrolyte with immune globulins, but that was never published, so I'm not quite sure, but there obviously was an awareness there of...
Who was directing the areas in which R&D would be aimed in the PFC at that time?
Jim Smith, Dr. Smith.
What resources were available to him?
Plasma.
As in laboratory and human resources?
In PFC,
Yes.
we had laboratory, we had equipment, we had plasma.
How many people?
Doing research or doing this
research.
development work. Well, there was me and I guess there was a couple of others, but it was mostly me doing coagulation factors.
Fair to say then there had to be a fair degree of prioritisation of the work that you were doing. We know that in 1981, after you had left, some 5 years after you had left, the Medicines Inspectorate gave a critical report of the PFC. In your experience, up until 1976, did the PFC meet the standards that you would have expected of a laboratory and fractionation centre?
Well, I didn't know any better. We were obviously trying to work as cleanly as possible. The Medicines Act had only just really come into play in 1969. So I think we were sort of, it sounds terrible, but it isn't meant to, making it up as we went along. We had to keep out bacteria, we had to keep out pyrogen in particular. And these were the things that drove us to work as cleanly as possible. And that's what we did. But the facilities in PFC at the time, and this is before it moved into its new facility out at Middleton, we were in the bowels of the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh. And in fact, which was not a particularly desirable place to be making clean products, but it was all we had.
How did it compare with your later experience of Spaywood?
Well, when I first went to Spaywood, the conditions were not great. We were working in a porter cabin and a garage, actually. So I got used to that sort of thing and amazingly made pyrogen-free product out of in some of these facilities. So.
Is it fair to say that then both your initial work in Spaywood and the work that you did at the PFC, your burdens were added to by the need to work hard to make pyrogen-free product in the physical surroundings?
Yes, it adds quite a lot of problems, and cleaning equipment and water quality and those sorts of things. So yes.
Moving to your time in Glasgow in 1976-79, you said something of it originally. But what kind of interaction, if any, did you have with haemophilia patients at that time?
Well, having moved to Glasgow, I was involved we were collecting blood samples from patients to check on their factor VIII levels after treatment, and looking at things like half-lives and those sorts of things.
The half-life of a factor VIII product that they've been given?
Yes.
Did you conduct any other routine blood tests on those patients at that time?
No, just factor assays.
Would you actually draw the blood yourself?
No, No, it was drawn by a nurse or a doctor.
And are you able to assist at all with what the consenting process was that the patient went through before giving that blood?
There wasn't, as I recall, there was no consenting process.
So the blood would be taken from the patient without the patient being told what the blood was going to be used for?
It might have been. It might have been.
But you personally weren't involved in those
No.
discussions with the patient?
No, I can't tell you if there was bits of paper signed or whatever was done. It wasn't that apparent because the number of patients within a haemophilia unit, the whole haemophilia unit is very much sort of like a family, and patients were coming in all the time to get their treatment and knew the haemophilia directors and the nurses intimately because they were there quite often. And I don't know what consenting processes would have been involved.
What, other than checking the blood for the effect of the factor VIII products, what other roles did you undertake at Glasgow?
Well, I actually looked at the factor IX concentrate, the defix factor IX concentration, and the super IX concentrate, and looked at using different assays to look at that thrombogenicity.
That was research work that you were doing
Yeah.
on the products rather than via
Yes,
patients?
on the products, yes, while I was there. I also did things to do with factor VIII assays, recoveries after exercise and various other things. I worked with, who's now Professor Lowe at the time, and we did some work with recovery of factor VIII with exercise and various other things like that, physiological effects.
What links did you have at that stage with your former colleagues at the PFC?
Well, I was still working. Peter Foster was there at that time. I suspect Jim Smith had left, I think. And he knew what I was doing because we subsequently wrote the paper about Super 9 and the PEG concentrate, so he knew what I was doing.
And did you have any links with pharmaceutical companies at that stage while you were at Glasgow?
No, the only pharmaceutical company that happened while I was in Glasgow was that David Heath, who you've heard mentioned, came into the lab while I was working to speak to my boss, Dr. Prentice, who was the haemophilia director, and started to talk about polyelectrolytes within my hearing. So that's how it came about that I ended up working for Spaywood.
You've preempted my next question,
Right.
which was how were you recruited to Spaywood in 1979? Was it
Well,
from that
essentially,
conversation?
I heard that conversation about polyelectrolyte. I also, and yes, I wrote to David and said, because I wanted to actually get back to something more production orientated, and explain my experience. And I got a letter by return of post saying, yes, when are you going to start? So that's what happened.
You then moved to Spaywood. Physically, where were you based when you were working for Spaywood?
Wrexham,
In Wrexham.
yes.
Did you have anything to do with the office in Nottinghamshire?
Not really. We went over there occasionally, myself and the production, I guess he would be the production director, Dr. Costello, and who was in charge of the Wrexham site. We occasionally went over there, but just to talk about progress with porcine, factor VIII.
You're so essentially going there for meetings, but never being based there, is that fair?
Yeah, no, never been based there.
Your title was Chief Scientist.
Yes.
What did that role entail?
Well, I sometimes thought it was because I was the only scientist at the time. It involved, my going there was primarily to develop porcine factor VIII. there was a problem with the current product, which was not soluble and couldn't be used. I subsequently sorted that problem out actually quite quickly, then went over to the States to pick up the polyelectrolyte, which seemed to be now working for factor VIII. So that's the way it went. I then came back and scaled the polyelectrolyte method up to produce high HC,
That's the porcine product.
the porcine product.
But when you say you went over to the States,
Yeah,
should we understand that to be
to
literally...
Dr. Johnson's lab.
Did you stay there for long and conduct research, or was it literally to pick up the polyelectrolyte
Well,
and
I
come
stayed there. I think I stayed there 3 or 4 weeks, just to make sure that the method worked, and because it previously hadn't for factor VIII, but it did work. So I then picked up the polyelectrolyte, brought it back to Wales, which is where we were, to Wrexham.
And so that we are clear, this is for polyelectrolyte that was being licensed from Monsanto.
Yes, it was.
The accountant's report from 1981 that we looked at earlier, and I know that you were in the room when we were going through the presentation earlier, it referred to there being 21 staff in Wrexham. I'm not going to ask you for what each one of them did as of 1981, but what kind of roles were those people doing?
Initially, there were not 21, but there was, initially, there was a technician in the lab who was doing factor VIII assays, mostly, and there were a collection of 3 or 4 or maybe 5 individuals who were responsible for collecting the blood from the abattoir.
The pig blood.
Yeah, collecting and separating it.
Then there was you as chief/sole scientist.
Yes, and then there was Dr. Costello, who actually was a botanist, but he was obviously a scientist as well. But he was in overall charge of the site and the personnel.
Who gave you directions about what it was that you should be doing?
Me.
We heard in the presentation about the importation of coate and humanate,
Yeah.
and its sale within the United Kingdom. What role, if any, did you have in the importation and sale of coate and humanate?
Very little knowledge of it. Certainly had no input at all.
We saw from the data sheet that it was the address given was the Nottingham address.
Yeah.
So far as you're aware, was the coate and humanate business run from Nottingham or from
Yes.
Wrexham?
No, from Nottingham.
Were you ever involved in the processes of seeking product licenses or dealing with the DHSS insofar as it related to coate and humanate?
No.
I'm going to quickly ask you, before we have a break, about porcine factor VIII and high 8C. You explained how you went and you picked up a polyelectrolyte and understood that it now worked in respect of factor VIII, and then you solved the problem that they had been having with it. In your statement, I won't take you to it, but paragraph 14, you say, I developed a production scale process to recover porcine factor VIII.
Yeah.
And then at paragraph 37, you say that you had little involvement in porcine factor VIII thereafter.
I had, after scaling up, yes, I showed the method to others. The other people, and they were perfectly capable of handling it. It was a very easy process, really. The difficulty with any factor VIII or factor IX concentrate is not so much making it, is knowing you've got the right thing at the end of it in terms of assays and analytical work, and knowing that there's no potential for clotting when you don't want clotting, so thrombogenicity, as we call it.
Did you have any role in that aspect of the work in terms of high HC?
The assay?
The assaying, the checking, the quality controlling of the...
Yes, to an extent, because I had experience of factor VIII assays are particularly difficult to standardise. And we did have a problem with porcine factor VIII because the kinetics of the production of porcine factor VIII are different between human and pigs. And there was a pig standard which was supplied by a commercial company which turned out to be wrong because of the way had been assayed. So yes, I had quite a lot of input into that. It's an interesting topic, the kinetics of blood clotting in pigs versus human. Sorry.
I won't go into too much detail about that, if you'll forgive me. But were you involved in any of the applications for product licenses for high HC?
Somebody else wrote them because I wasn't there at the time.
Had you left the company by that stage?
I was either, I may not have left, I might have been somewhere else, like at Elstree or in Paris, or I also worked on deficient plasmas and various other things. So I was sometimes away from Speywood. And I don't think that license was applied for until the manufacturing facility had been built.
Yes.
And so don't think, I might have done, I don't remember whether I did or not.
I can tell you that I haven't found many papers with your name on in connection with
The
high
product.
HC.
The product licensing or anything.
And indeed the product license.
Yeah, okay, well, in that case I didn't.
We know that we haven't looked at this in the presentations, and we will come back to that at a later date, but we know that the application for the product license was made on the 29th of November 1983.
Oh, right, okay.
The license was granted on the 3rd of December 1984.
Right.
Would you have still been working at Wrexham for Speywood at that time?
Well, no, I don't. Now you come to mention it, I actually don't know, because I didn't really work full time at Wrexham for a long time after I went and worked down at Elstree.
At BPL?
At BPL. And I don't know, but if you ask where I was, I know I was doing work at the Royal Free on depleted plasmas, for example. And I just was working in other people's labs, I think.
Is it fair to say then that, certainly from your current recollection, you didn't have a great deal of input into the finalisation of the product, high HC?
No, I don't think I did. Well, in the sense that I did formulate it, and I did develop assays and various other things, and I did have a interaction with NIBS, NIBSC, about the assay, because that caused us all a lot of confusion at one stage. So I was doing that.
Were you involved in, for example, directing the thinking about where this product should be used and which cohort of patients it should be used with?
Not really, it was inhibitor patients as far as I was concerned.
That's where my question is leading to. When the product licence went in, we'll look at this in due course, it is very expressly said to be for inhibitor patients.
Yeah.
One question that the Chair may wish to consider in due course is why porcine factor VIII in the mid-1980s, at a time of risk of both hepatitis and AIDS, was directed towards inhibitor patients rather than the wider population
Of patients without an inhibitor.
without inhibitors.
Yeah.
Are you able to give any insight into that question from your perspective?
Well, from what I knew, First of all, original porcine factor 8 had a shocking reputation. This is before high-HC. It was a really toxic product. It produced thrombocytopenia, platelet reduction because of this so-called platelet activating factor, which was thought to cause this problem. They had allergic reactions to the protein, etc. When it came to high-HC, it was much more highly purified and actually was very well tolerated by patients. But there was the concern that it would potentially, in non-inhibitor patients, produce a cross-reacting inhibitor to human factor 8.
And it follows from that by
Yes.
taking this product, they would
Yes.
then render themselves incapable of taking a human
Yes.
factor 8 plasma product
Yes,
in the future.
and that was the big unknown concern.
So, were there any other reasons you think that?
Well, I think you were going to be giving pig protein to people, and again, that might be a risk of creating allergic reactions to the pig protein, which had been seen in the past with much less pure product. So I don't think people wanted to use it.
We will come back to that, sir, as I say, in due course when we look at some further papers. I'm going to move on from porcine factor 8 to human factor 8, so I wonder if now might be a convenient moment.
Well, how much longer do you think you might be?
Probably, sir, about another half an hour or so.
Because I am concerned that we leave plenty of time for you to pick up questions from those core participants who might want to ask them. Yes, so we'll take 25 minutes and come back, therefore, at 10 to 4.
Thanks.